I already handled it, my mother said, not looking up from slicing the ham, so you can stop being so dramatic about money, just like your father used to be. She said it the way you'd mention you'd finally defrosted the freezer. But this really starts 30 years before that Christmas with a much smaller number and a much smaller version of me. My name is Tamsin Ridley. I'm 34, and for the last 8 years, I've worked as a court appointed advocate for children in family court, the person a judge sends in to find out what's actually true when the adults in a family can't be trusted to say it themselves. That Christmas, in front of my husband and my 7-year-old daughter, my mother told the whole table she'd handled the education trust meant for my daughter the way you'd mentioned you'd finally gotten around to defrosting the freezer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her a single follow up question at that table. But what she didn't know was that I'd already filed a formal request for a full accounting of that trust 4 months earlier, quietly, the way I do everything for a living. 6 weeks later, a judge would ask my mother one question she had no honest answer for. And months after that, my daughter would ride a rocking horse my mother sold 30 years before I was old enough to understand what she'd actually taken from me. Nobody in that dining room saw it coming from quiet, agreeable Tamsin, the daughter who never made a scene. Welcome back to Calm Stories, where the ones who kept the peace for everyone else finally tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and go ahead and subscribe. Let me back up. My parents, Judith and Arthur Ridley, live in Colby Creek, a small enough town that the elementary school and the middle school share a parking lot. My father is 68, gentle in the specific, exhausted way of a man who has spent 40 years agreeing with his wife rather than risk finding out what happens when he doesn't. My mother is 65, sharp, capable, the kind of woman other people describe as formidable when they mean something more complicated than that. When my daughter Marlo was born, my husband Miles and I opened a 529 education account for her the way responsible young parents do, funded it with what we could afford plus a modest inheritance from Miles's grandmother. And because my mother lived 20 minutes from the credit union and had, at the time, nothing but good intentions as far as either of us could tell, we named her as a secondary authorized signer, a backup in case something ever happened to us both at once. It felt, at the time, like the responsible thing to do. It is the decision I have spent the last year quietly, calmly unraveling. I remember the actual afternoon we signed the paperwork because Miles asked, half joking, whether we should maybe list his own mother instead, since she lived out of state but had, in his words, a calmer relationship with money. I laughed it off. I told him my mother had managed a family trust responsibly for 15 years by that point, that she was, if anything, overly careful with other people's money and that it would hurt her feelings terribly if we didn't ask. I want you to notice that sentence the way I still do. I made a decision about my newborn daughter's education fund based on the risk of hurting my mother's feelings. I would tell any parent I've ever worked with in family court in a heartbeat without hesitating that this is exactly the kind of reasoning that gets children's money quietly taken. I didn't hear myself saying it at the time. You rarely do when it's your own family and not a case file. That decision cost me nothing for the first 11 years. That's the part that makes it so easy to make in the first place. There was a second layer to it, too, one I didn't fully understand the shape of until much later. My father's mother, my grandmother, whom I barely remember, had left behind, when she died, a modest family trust explicitly earmarked for the education of the grandchildren and great grandchildren to be managed by whichever family member was most capable with numbers. That fell to my mother more than 20 years ago because my father has never once in his life balanced a checkbook without her standing over his shoulder. That trust, grown quietly through 2 decades of ordinary investment, had become, by the time Marlo was born, worth enough that her individually designated share, the portion of it earmarked specifically for her, once you added it to what Miles and I had contributed ourselves, came to just over $340,000. I want to tell you about the Christmas gathering in full because it's where all of this became impossible to keep ignoring. We were at my parents' house, the same table we'd eaten at every Christmas of my life, my mother's good china out for its one appearance of the year. Marlo was showing my father a drawing she'd made, and my mother was carving the ham, and into that ordinary noise, she announced, without anyone asking, that she'd moved the trust into something safer, and that we shouldn't worry ourselves about the details. I asked, as gently as I could manage, what safer meant. She said, a rental property, real assets, not some account that just sits there losing value to inflation while everyone pretends that's responsible. I asked whose name the property was in. She said, does it matter? It's for the family, and changed the subject to whether Marlowe wanted more potatoes. I didn't push it further at the table. I have spent 34 years learning exactly how far you can push my mother in front of witnesses before the conversation becomes about your tone instead of her answer. And Christmas dinner was not the hill I intended to plant a flag on. But I want you to know what she said next, because it's the sentence that told me this had never really been about a rental property. When I said, quietly, that I probably want to see the paperwork at some point, just to understand it, she looked at me, really looked, the specific look she's given me my whole life when she's deciding whether I'm worth the effort of a real answer, and said, you were always so dramatic about money, just like your father used to be, before I taught him better. My father, across the table, didn't say anything at all. He just reached for the potatoes. Under the table, Miles found my hand and pressed it once. Briefly, the small signal we developed over 11 years of holidays at that particular table. A signal that meant, I see it too, and we'll talk about it later, and you don't have to fight this battle here. I squeezed back. Marlowe, 4 seats down, was too busy explaining her drawing to my father to notice any of it, which was exactly how I wanted it. Whatever this was going to become, I already knew it wasn't going to become a scene at a Christmas table with a 7-year-old watching. I need to take you back 30 years now, because that sentence wasn't random, and I don't think my mother even realized what she was reaching for when she said it. When I was 12, my own grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Constance who died when I was small enough that I mostly remember her hands, had left me a modest graduation fund, $4,000, meant to help with whatever came after high school. My mother was named custodian, the same arrangement, the same trust, just smaller and 30 years earlier. When I was 14, our family car broke down twice in one winter, transmission both times, and my mother, without ever discussing it with me, used just over half of that fund to cover the repairs. I found out by accident years later, going through old bank statements while helping her organize paperwork after my father's minor heart scare. She'd never told me. When I finally asked her about it, gently, the way I ask about everything, she said, you didn't need it as badly as we needed that car, Tamsin. I made a decision for the family. That's what mothers do. She wasn't wrong that the car mattered. She was never once, in that entire conversation, sorry that she hadn't told me. I remember oddly that I'd had a specific plan for that money. The kind of plan only a 12-year-old builds with total confidence. A summer program for kids interested in law, 2 states away, that I'd circled in a brochure and kept folded in my desk drawer for 2 years. I never told my mother about the brochure. I think somewhere underneath everything else, I already understood at 12 that showing her something I wanted was the surest way to watch it quietly become unavailable. I didn't fight her about it back then either. I was 26 years old the day I found those statements, already a working adult, and I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that dwelling on $4,000 from a decade earlier was its own kind of small, ungrateful thing to do. I filed it away, the same way I'd learned, years later, to file away so many other things about my mother. What I didn't understand yet was that filing it away hadn't made it disappear. It had just been waiting for a second, larger version of the same story to arrive. What Judith didn't know was that her daughter had grown up to spend a career learning exactly how to build a case out of the things families would rather nobody looked at too closely. The week after Christmas, I called the credit union, using nothing but my own name and my legal standing as Marlowe's parent, and asked for the most recent statements on the education account. I was told politely that the account had been closed 11 months earlier, its balance transferred at my mother's direction as authorized signer, and that I should contact the receiving institution for further details. I hadn't been notified, neither had Miles. An account can, apparently, close itself out from under two attentive parents entirely quietly, as long as the person holding a second set of authority decides quiet is easier. I didn't call my mother that night. I sat in my car in the credit union parking lot for a long time instead, the way I imagine a lot of people have sat in a lot of parking lots this year, and I thought about a 14-year-old version of me who never got an explanation either. I told Miles everything that night after Marla was asleep, sitting on the kitchen floor because neither of us had the energy to make it to the couch. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which is a specific skill of his. I've never stopped being grateful for. And when I finished, he asked only one question: "What do you actually want to happen?" Not what I wanted to happen to my mother, what I wanted to happen, full stop. I hadn't let myself think about it in those terms yet. I'd been so busy gathering facts that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what I was gathering them for. I told him, finally, that I wanted Marlowe's money back and I wanted it to never be possible for this to happen to her again. And I didn't, if I was honest, know yet whether I wanted my mother in our lives afterward or not. Miles said that was allowed. He said I didn't have to know that part yet. It was the first full breath I'd taken in a week. Here's the small test, the one I ran without calling it that at the time. I called my mother 2 days later and asked warmly, casually, if she could just send me copies of the recent statements for my own records, since Miles and I like to keep our files organized. She said she'd get around to it. She did not get around to it. I asked again 10 days later, and she said the new bank was slow with paperwork requests. I have spent 8 years listening to adults explain away things that don't add up, and I know exactly what that particular flavor of slow sounds like. It sounds like a door being held shut very politely. What she didn't know was that I hadn't actually needed her to send me anything. 4 months before that Christmas dinner, because irregularities in the account had already caught my attention over the summer, months before my mother ever stood up with her carving knife and announced anything, I had quietly filed, through my own attorney, a formal petition for a full accounting of the Family Education Trust on Marlowe's behalf, as is any beneficiary's legal right. It had been sitting in a clerk's queue since August. My mother's Christmas announcement wasn't the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment she found out, without knowing she'd found out, that the accounting she'd been avoiding for months was already coming for her either way. If you've ever sat quietly at a family dinner already knowing something the room hasn't caught up to yet, drop a comment and subscribe. The part where it actually surfaces is coming, and I promise you it is in a shouting match. My attorney, a calm, exacting woman named Simone Castellano, who specializes in family trust disputes, walked me through what the accounting eventually turned up piece by piece over the late winter. The rental property my mother had mentioned so casually at Christmas was real. It existed in Colby Creek's public records, purchased 14 months earlier for $290,000, titled solely in my mother's name, not in the trust's name, not held for the beneficiaries it was supposed to serve. The remaining 50,000 or so had gone to a mix of home renovations at my parents' own house and a family vacation the year before. One I remembered attending, one where my mother had paid for everyone's flights and told us all how lucky we were to have a mother who still liked to spoil people. I want to be fair to her here, the way I tried to be fair through this whole thing, because I don't think my mother is a cartoon. When Simone and I eventually pieced together the full 20-year history of the trust, we found that my mother genuinely had, for most of those years, managed it honestly. Small, careful investments, modest growth, nothing extravagant. Something changed around the time my father's small business finally failed for good, 4 years ago, and the two of them quietly started running short. I don't think my mother woke up one morning and decided to become a thief. I think she woke up one morning frightened about money in a way she'd spent her whole life being frightened about money, going back, I'd guess, to whatever her own mother never gave her either. And she made a choice, and then another choice built on top of that one. And by the time either choice built on top of that one, and by the time either choice might have felt undoable, $340,000 of it belonged, on paper, to a rental property with her name on the deed. That doesn't make it not theft. I want to be clear about that too. It just means I understand now a little better than I did at Christmas, where the sentence about my father came from. Fear and theft can share a bed for years before anyone in the house notices which one is actually driving. I don't say that to excuse her. I say it because understanding where a wound came from and still deciding it doesn't get to cost your daughter her education are two things a person can hold in the same hand. And it took me most of that spring to learn how. There was one more piece Simone's early digging turned up that I hadn't expected, and it changed how I understood the whole thing. My cousin Delia, my mother's sister's daughter, whose own two boys had shares in the same family trust, called me out of nowhere in early spring. Cautious, clearly unsure whether she was allowed to be asking what she was asking. She'd heard through the family's usual slow grapevine that I'd hired a lawyer about Grandma's trust, and she wanted to know, gently, whether she should be worried too. I told her as honestly as I could without overstepping what Simone had advised me to say out loud, that she probably should at least ask for her own statements. Delia went quiet on the phone for a moment and then said, I always wondered why Aunt Judith got so cagey whenever I brought it up at Easter. I hadn't been trying to build a bigger case than my own daughter's. I hadn't wanted one, but it settled something for me hearing that, a confirmation that this had never really been a private disagreement between a mother and a daughter about one rental property. It was a 20-year pattern with more names attached to it than mine. I didn't call my mother about Delia's call either. I added it quietly to the file Simone was building, and I kept driving Marlowe to school every morning like it was any other spring. I have to slow down here and tell you about the day everything actually changed for me because it wasn't the credit union parking lot and it wasn't Simone's phone call about the rental property. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I was buckling Marlowe into her booster seat after school, and she asked me, out of absolutely nowhere, in the particular unguarded way 7-year-olds ask the questions adults have spent years learning not to ask out loud, why doesn't Grandma ever come to my stuff? Like my assembly. Or my piano thing. I told her Grandma was busy. Marlowe considered that for a second, the way kids consider an answer they don't quite believe, and said, okay, are you going to come to my next one? And I said, without even having to think about it, yes, I'll be there early. I'll be the first one there. I don't think Marlowe understood what she'd just done. I sat in that parking lot afterward, car in park, and understood something I hadn't let myself understand in 30 years of filing things away. My mother had never once, in my entire childhood, come to something small and ordinary of mine just because it was mine. She showed up for the big things, graduations, the wedding, the things with an audience. She had never once shown up for a Tuesday. And I realized sitting there that the $4,000 and the $340,000 weren't actually the same story about money. They were the same story about a mother who had never learned that showing up for the small, unglamorous, unwitnessed moments is the entire job, and who had, without ever meaning to, been quietly asking me my whole life to prove I deserved the big ones first. Something changes in a woman the day she realizes she's not angry about the money anymore. She's angry about every ordinary Tuesday nobody thought was worth the drive. I didn't call my mother that afternoon either. I did one small, quiet thing instead. I texted Marlowe's school and confirmed the date of her spring piano recital, put it in my calendar with 2 exclamation points, the kind of thing you do for any ordinary Tuesday that actually matters. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even really about my mother at all anymore. It was the first time in my adult life I made a decision about showing up for my daughter that had nothing to do with what my own mother had or hadn't taught me it was supposed to look like. My mother, meanwhile, had noticed the accounting petition. Simone's office had correctly and by law notified all named parties once it moved forward, and she did the thing I should have expected and somehow still didn't. She called my father's sister, my Aunt Ruth, and enlisted her to call my father, who then called me gently, apologetically, to ask if there was really any need to involve lawyers over family business. I love my father. I want that said plainly because this isn't a story where he gets to be simple. He has spent 40 years choosing the path of least resistance in his own marriage, and it has cost him more than he's ever said out loud. And I could hear, underneath his careful borrowed sentence about lawyers, a man who wasn't entirely sure he agreed with what he was saying. I told him I loved him and that this wasn't about family business. It was about a legal document with Marlowe's name on it, and he went quiet for a moment and said, your mother did the same thing to you once. Did you know that? The car. I told him I did know. He didn't say anything else for a long time, and then he said, so quietly, I almost missed it. I should have said something back then too, and changed the subject to the weather, the way this family changes the subject to the weather whenever the truth gets too close to the surface. It was Aunt Ruth, oddly enough, who gave me the piece I hadn't been looking for at all. She called a few weeks later, ostensibly to smooth things over on my mother's behalf, and somewhere in that conversation, almost as an aside, she mentioned the rocking horse. Your father made that thing himself, you know, she said. Spent a whole winter on it, out in the garage, when you were 3. Best thing he ever built. I always thought it was such a shame your mother sold it at that yard sale. I hadn't thought about the rocking horse in 25 years. I have a single hazy memory of it. Dark wood, a painted mane, the particular creak of its runners on the porch. And then nothing, no memory of it disappearing, just its absence. The kind of gap in a childhood you don't notice until someone hands you the edges of it. I asked Ruth why my mother had sold it. She hesitated and then said, "You'd had some kind of tantrum, I think, over a toy, something small. Your mother said a girl who couldn't appreciate what she had didn't deserve the nice things people worked hard to make her." I was 3 years old. I don't remember the tantrum. I don't imagine it was anything a 3-year-old wouldn't grow out of within a week. But the rocking horse never came back, and neither, as far as I can tell, did my mother's habit of measuring what I deserved against how gratefully I performed deserving it. Stay with me. The hearing is coming, and it's the calmest, quietest reversal I've ever been part of on either side of a courtroom. Drop a comment and subscribe so you're there for it. I spent an evening after that call doing something that had nothing to do with Simone or the accounting or any of it. I searched online for antique rocking horses from local estate sales, going back years on nothing but a hunch and a hazy memory of dark wood and the painted mane. It took 3 nights of searching before I found a listing. 4 years old, from an antique shop 2 towns over, description matching close enough that my hands were shaking a little when I called. The owner remembered it, said it had been a genuinely fine piece of carving, hand done, not a kit, and that it had sold to a private buyer and never resurfaced. That was, for the moment, a dead end. I wasn't going to get the actual horse back, but I sat with that dead end for exactly one evening, and then I called my father directly, not through Ruth, not through my mother, and asked him if he still remembered how he'd built it. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I think I could still find the plans. I kept everything in a box in the garage." He offered, before I even asked, to build a new one for Marlowe, if that wouldn't be strange. I told him it wouldn't be strange at all. It would mean everything. The hearing was scheduled for late spring in family court in front of Judge Ades Okunquag, a formal accounting hearing, the kind that happens in a plain room with fluorescent lighting and nothing dramatic about the furniture, which is, I've come to believe, exactly where the truth is safest. My mother came with her own attorney. My father came too, sitting one row behind her rather than beside her, which I don't think was an accident, though nobody said so out loud. I caught his eye once, early on, and he gave me the smallest nod I've ever seen a person give, the kind meant to be invisible to everyone except the one person it was for. Simone laid out the accounting cleanly, the trust's original terms, the 20 years of honest management, the 14-month-old rental property titled solely in my mother's name, the 50,000 in renovations and vacations, the 11 months my mother had let the closed account sit unreported to any of the parents whose children it was meant to protect. Judge Okonkwo asked my mother directly whether she had informed Marlowe's parents before closing the account. My mother said she'd intended to once things settled. The judge asked what, specifically, had needed to settle. My mother didn't have an answer for that. Not a dishonest one, not an honest one, just a long pause in a fluorescent lit room which told everyone in it everything a shouted denial never could have. I asked, when it was my turn to speak, to read one short thing into the record, and the judge allowed it. I didn't raise my voice. I read 2 sentences, one after the other, with nothing but a pause between them. In 2006, my mother used $4,000 from my own education fund without informing me, and told me later that a daughter who didn't need it as badly as the family did shouldn't be dramatic about money. In 2025, my mother used $340,000 from my daughter's education fund without informing us, and told me the same thing, almost word for word, 30 years apart. I set both statements on the table in front of me, side by side, the way you'd lay 2 photographs next to each other and let someone else notice they were the same picture. My mother didn't shout, not exactly, but her voice rose in a way I'd heard my whole life. The particular register she uses when she's losing an argument, she still believes she should be winning. Something about ingratitude, about how none of us understood what it cost to hold a family together, about how she'd sacrifice things nobody in that room would ever appreciate. Judge Okonkwo let her finish. Then, in the same even voice she'd used the entire hearing, she asked my mother to step down as trustee of the Family Education Trust effective immediately, ordered a structured repayment plan tied to the rental property's equity, and appointed an independent professional trustee, someone with no family stake at all, to oversee what remained of it for every grandchild and great grandchild it had ever been meant to protect. A woman raising her voice about sacrifice and a woman quietly reading 2 sentences, 30 years apart, do not look like equals in a room like that. They look like exactly what they are. Here's the fallout, because I promised you this whole thing. Honestly, start to finish. My mother is repaying the trust on a schedule Simone helped structure tied to the rental property over the next several years. She was formally removed as trustee, and an independent fiduciary now manages what's left for every cousin who has a share in it, not just Marlowe's, which meant, it turned out, three other families I hadn't even known were affected got their own accounting too, once the door was open. My mother has not apologized to me. Not really. Not the way I once might have needed her to. What she said the one time we spoke directly after the hearing was, "I hope you're satisfied," which isn't an apology, but I've stopped needing it to be one. I haven't cut my mother off entirely, and I want to be honest with you about why, because I know some of you would have, and I don't think you'd be wrong to. Marlo still knows her grandmother exists. She sees her a few times a year, always somewhere public, always with Miles or me present, never overnight, never alone. A boundary I set calmly once and have not had to repeat because my mother, to her credit, has not tested it. It isn't reconciliation. It isn't severance either. It's the door held at exactly the width I've decided it can safely be held. And I've made my peace with living in that particular in between. My father built the rocking horse over that spring, out in the same garage, using plans he'd kept in a box for 30 years, and he brought it to the house himself the week before Marlowe's 7th birthday. No, her 8th by then. Since all of this took the better part of a year to unfold the way these things actually do. He'd sanded it smooth as anything, painted the mane a deep, glossy chestnut brown, and when Marlowe climbed onto it for the first time, she asked him who'd made it. He told her he had. She asked him to teach her how, someday. He said he would. I go to every recital now, every assembly, every ordinary Tuesday thing, the ones with no audience and nothing at stake except a 7-year-old scanning the room to see if anyone came. The spring piano recital was the first one, after all of it, the hearing, the trustee, all of it settled or at least steadied. It was held in the elementary school gymnasium, folding chairs on a basketball court, a upright piano rolled out from the music room with one sticking key that every kid that afternoon carefully avoided. I got there 40 minutes early and sat in the second row, dead center, and watched the room fill in slowly behind me with other parents balancing juice boxes and phones held up for video. Marlowe played for Elise, the simplified version, and she hit the sticking key once, in the second line, and didn't flinch, just kept going the way her teacher had clearly drilled into all of them. When she finished, she didn't look for the applause first. She looked for me. I was already standing. Afterward, in the hallway, she asked if Grandma Judith had wanted to come. I told her the truth, the simple version a 7-year-old can hold, that Grandma had a lot going on right now and wasn't able to make it, but that I was there, and Dad had watched the video 3 times already, even though he'd been at work and hadn't been able to come either. She considered that with the particular seriousness kids bring to information that matters more than they can quite say, and then she said, as long as somebody's always there. I told her somebody would always be there. I meant it as a promise, not a comfort. I'm always early now. I'm always the first one there. Here's what I've learned, and I think it's worth saying plainly, the cycle doesn't end because you finally forgive the person who started it. It ends because you refuse to hand it to the next person standing in line for it, and you show up on purpose for every unglamorous Tuesday that never had an audience to prove it mattered. That's my story. One Christmas ham, one rocking horse that took 30 years, and one honest carpenter to come home. And a courtroom where the quietest person in the room turned out to be the one holding two matching sentences 30 years apart. If any of this sounds like your family, take this as your sign that you're allowed to ask for the paperwork, ask twice, and keep showing up for the ordinary Tuesdays regardless of what anyone else decides to do with theirs. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.